So, hey guys, welcome to another episode of Inglês no Rádio. Today on the show, we have a special guest, Ben Worthington from IELTS Podcast.com. Ben, welcome to the show.
Hello there, Foster. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm glad we finally got started with this interview because, as the audience probably don't know, we've been back and forth a few times, Foster and I. But yeah, finally we managed to get it sorted today. So really looking forward to this. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. So, Ben, I think the first thing that a lot of our listeners will probably think is, where is this guy from? Because your accent is much different than mine. So where do you come from, Ben?
Yeah, I think I still have a British accent, but I've lived a long time outside of England. I'm originally from Huddersfield, which is like near Leeds, Manchester, up north.
Mm-hmm.
I usually tell people, yeah, it's like the civilized part of England. Yeah, it's been a long time since I've lived there, probably a good 15 years or so, probably longer. But I moved to Spain and I lived there for 12 years. And then I moved out of Spain, went to Asia for a while. And then since I've left Spain, I've just been bouncing around in different countries. And I think nowadays, some of the words I pronounce are still pronounced in with a Yorkshire accent, or at least a Northern accent. But a lot of it has been kind of like internationalized. And that's why some people say it's easier for me to be understood.
Yeah, very cool. Where did you live in Spain, just out of curiosity?
I lived in a beautiful city. They call it a city, but for me, by my standards, it's a town, but they get offended. So anyway, it's a beautiful city called Valencia, on the coast, in between Granada and Barcelona.
Yeah, I would say Valencia it's a city. Yeah, for me, it's a city.
Yeah, that's interesting because you're from the States and you'd say it's a city. I'm from like a smaller country for me. But anyway, yeah, the actual official, in the UK anyway, the official criteria for it to be a city isn't much. It just has to have a cathedral. I don't know what the deal is in. For me, it was a little bit small, but it was still a beautiful place, and the people there are very friendly. It's I've got very fond memories.
Yeah, good food. Cool. So, Ben, you are not on the podcast to talk about orange trees and Valencia. We're here to talk about IELTS. So, in general, we talk a lot about conversation, about pronunciation, about the sounds of English. But I don't think we have ever, in almost 400 episodes, we've never talked about IELTS, and it's something we receive a lot of questions about.
Right.
So if you just want to start by giving us kind of an introduction, what is IELTS? Why should people take it? What's going on?
Gotcha. Okay. Well, the IELTS stands for the International English Language Testing System. This was basically a project between British Council and IELTS IDP Australia back in the 70s. I think in the 70s it was called something like the Davies test. But anyway, what it's used for is if you want to study in Canada, Ireland, the UK, or Australia, New Zealand, and increasingly in the US, if you want to study in those countries, they'll usually say, okay, you need an IELTS score of 7, or you need an IELTS score of 9, depending on the discipline that you choose. So you can take the IELTS to get into the universities in those countries, and you can also take the IELTS exam for immigration purposes.
Right.
For example, if you want to go for PR, permanent residency in Australia, you've got to show that you're able to speak the language. So they're going to ask you for probably something like a band 7 in all of the disciplines, and that's reading, speaking, listening, and writing. And it's not as easy as you'd think. Like, even native English speakers can, like, say if they need a band 7, they can easily walk out with a band 6.5. So it's not quite straightforward. It is a challenge. So if it's a challenge for native English speakers, it's definitely a challenge for non-native English speakers as well.
Yeah, I can imagine. And just to clarify, when you say band 7, band 9, those are the different levels, the grades of the IELTS, correct?
Exactly. It starts, I think, around maybe a band 4 or 5, I think. And then the maximum you can get is a band 9. And that's probably got the equivalency of something like a C2 if we use the Common European Framework of Languages or whatever it's called.
Right. You're totally fluent natives. Yeah.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. So Ben, can I ask kind of perhaps an ignorant question? What is the big difference between the TOEFL and the IELTS?
Right. It's not ignorant. I get this question all the time. Basically, the TOEFL is the one that traditionally, the US institutions have preferred. Yeah. They said, okay, get me a TOEFL, pass the TOEFL at this level, and you can come and join our university.
Right.
So they're both doing the same thing. I think the biggest difference is probably the speaking part, because with the TOEFL, you sit there in a room and you've got some headphones on and you're speaking into the computer. Whereas with the IELTS, you're sitting there in front of a trained examiner, and they're there and they're going to be assessing your ability face to face. And for some people, they prefer that. And there's some arguments that that's a real test of your language ability. And then there's other arguments that, okay, this other human being makes me nervous and I cannot reflect my true ability. So there's pros and cons for each one. But just to summarize, the TOEFL is definitely accepted and probably the most popular exam for the US institutions, whereas all the other countries I mentioned a few minutes ago, they'll usually insist on the IELTS exam.
Right. And I think I'm starting to see more institutions in the United States accept both the IELTS and the TOEFL. So I think it's becoming more popular in the US as well.
Absolutely. I think that IELTS is making the organization and making a big push into the US because they used to have a monopoly over the exam in Australia, but then the government reversed that decision and said, no, we're going to start accepting other tests. So they started to expand because the golden goose was being cooked, so to speak.
Okay. So Ben, let's get directly into the exam and a lot of the problems that students might face. And the first thing that comes to my mind that a lot of students have asked me about is vocabulary, and specifically vocabulary for these kinds of tests. And honestly, because I don't focus on standardized testing, I don't really have a good answer for them to how to improve their vocabulary specifically for these kinds of things. Do you have any ideas about that?
Gotcha, yeah. Well, for the speaking, the vocabulary, I think because in the speaking, you've got to go there with the attitude of though it's like, as though it's a job interview, so you can't be as relaxed as though when you're speaking with your friends, but you don't want to be super formal in that you're speaking like, oh, one should definitely, you don't want to be talking like so stuffy and formal. So you've got to, it's kind of like neutral, semi-formal, I think is probably the best way.
Yeah.
But for that, your vocabulary, there are a few tricks. I always suggest to the students that if they can give examples, yeah? So if you're talking maybe in the exam, I'll just briefly explain the exam format and
sure.
We'll focus on speaking and then they'll go on to the writing. But for the speaking, there's 3 parts to this exam. Part 1, where you come in and you get to know the examiner will get to know you, put you at ease, ask you simple questions. Are you working? Are you a student? And all this kind of stuff.
Right.
Those are just general, easy questions to relax you, as a student. And then you'll be given the choice of 3 cue cards. And on these 3 cue cards, you choose one. And on that card, there'll be just a question prompt with some bullet points. So it might say something like, describe a recent holiday that you went on. Bullet point 1, describe where you went. Number 2, describe what you saw, who you went with. And number 3, it might be something like, describe a fun activity you did together or you did with somebody. Yeah?
Yeah.
And then you've got to speak about this for 2 minutes. And this is where an example comes in handy because, well, you can just say the words. I don't know. We had a lot of fun and we had we made a lot of enjoyable memories from this holiday I had in France. For example, one afternoon, my brother and we were playing, and a football got booted over the fence, and my brother had to climb over, blah, 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 But just by giving this example, now I've used some good vocabulary. I've mentioned the word fence. I used the verb to boot. I used, some more vocabulary about football. And then I can go into this little story about my brother climbing over the fence, about him, getting hit over the head by a saucepan by the neighbor, and just random stuff like that. But I can go into details, and I can show the examiner that I can speak about this topic,
Right. That's awesome.
That's like one way you can improve, or you can show the examiner that you've got good vocabulary for the speaking. Yeah. Also, what's really useful, and this is a good transition into the writing, but if you can talk about topic-specific vocabulary, yeah?
Yeah.
So in part 3, what happens is you start getting more advanced questions, more difficult questions, more abstract questions. So it'd be something like, why do you think holidaying is an important part of society? Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, that's a hell of a question.
Yeah. And because in part 3, this is where you're going to get basically over a 7 or above. Yeah, a band 7 or above. So you're going to answer the question like, well, I think holidaying is an important part because nowadays in society, a lot of people complain about being overworked, about being stressed out, and about not having enough free time.
I agree with all 3 of those things.
Yeah, but just by giving that little list there, what I did is I used topic-specific vocabulary, which is like vocabulary that is unique to this topic about holidaying. So it's like overworked, stressed out, and free time. And these are just little ways you can improve or boost your score with regards to vocabulary in the speaking test.